The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the city. The streets were empty, save for the faint echo of footsteps in the distance. A group of 5 criminals huddled in the darkened back room of an abandoned warehouse, their eyes sharp with anticipation. This was supposed to be an easy job. A simple heist. The royal palace, known for its wealth and opulence, was their target. The plan was flawless. Slip past the guards, grab the loot, and disappear into the night. No one would be the wiser. Marcus, the leader, paced in front of the group, his mind sharp and calculating. He had led dozens of heists in his career, and each one had gone off without a hitch. This would be no different. "All right, listen up," he said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. "We hit them fast, we hit them hard. The vault's our target. We're in and out before anyone knows we're there. No mistakes. Got it?" The others nodded, their faces grim. They were all hardened criminals, used to getting what they wanted by any means necessary. They knew the risks, but they also knew the rewards. Tonight they would be rich. The crew moved silently through the streets, their footsteps barely audible against the cobblestones. They were almost there. The palace loomed ahead, its towering walls bathed in the soft light of the moon. Marcus held up a hand, signaling for the crew to stop. He crouched low, peering around the corner. The guards were in their usual positions, patrolling the perimeter. Their movements were predictable. The crew had studied them for days. They knew exactly when and where to strike. "Move," Marcus whispered, and they slipped through the shadows, unseen and unheard. They reached the palace gates without incident, and Marcus gave a signal. The door creaked open, and they were inside. The palace was a labyrinth of grand halls and ornate chambers, but the crew knew exactly where they were going. The vault was just ahead. They had planned for every possible contingency, except one. As they approached the vault, a faint noise caught Marcus' attention. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a whisper in the air. But it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of boots on stone. The unmistakable rhythm of soldiers marching in unison. Marcus froze. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't part of the plan. The guards were supposed to be on their usual patrols, not marching in formation. Something was wrong. The crew exchanged nervous glances, their confidence slipping away. They hadn't expected this. The noise grew louder, and before they could react, the soldiers appeared from the shadows. They were tall, their uniforms dark and imposing, their faces cold and unreadable. But it wasn't their appearance that caught the crew off guard. It was the way they moved. Every step, every gesture, was deliberate. Precise. These weren't ordinary palace guards. These were something else entirely. Marcus' heart raced. He had seen soldiers before, but these men were different. They were elite. And they were closing in fast. "Who are you?" one of the soldiers demanded, his voice deep and commanding. His eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What are you doing here?" Marcus tried to bluff, his voice steady despite the growing panic inside him. "We're just here for the money. You don't need to get involved." The soldier's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I think you'll find that this is not your night." Before Marcus could react, the soldier raised his hand, signaling to the others. The crew was surrounded. There was no way out. The elite guards moved with a fluidity that made it clear they had been trained for situations like this. They were calm, unfazed, and they weren't going to let the crew get away with this. The criminals tried to fight back, but it was futile. The soldiers were too fast, too skilled. One by one, the crew was disarmed and restrained. They had no chance. The soldiers moved like shadows, their every action precise and calculated. It was clear now, they weren't dealing with ordinary palace guards. These men were professionals. As Marcus struggled, he felt a deep sense of humiliation. They had planned for everything, except this. They had underestimated their enemies. They had thought they were the predators, the ones in control. But now they were the prey. And they had no idea how to escape. The soldiers didn't speak much, but their actions spoke volumes. They didn't need to say anything. They had already won. The criminals were no match for them. Marcus' mind raced. How had they gotten it so wrong? They had assumed that the palace was poorly defended, that the guards would be easy to outsmart. But these men were different. They were trained to protect the palace at all costs, and they were willing to do whatever it took to stop the intruders. As the crew was marched away, bound and defeated, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. They had underestimated the strength and professionalism of the royal guards. These men were not just soldiers, they were warriors, men who had dedicated their lives to defending the kingdom. And they had just proven that no one, no matter how skilled or ruthless, could break through their defenses. The criminals were led into the darkness, their plans shattered, their pride broken. They had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. The guards, despite their calm demeanor, were a force to be reckoned with. And in that moment, Marcus realized something he had never considered before. It wasn't just about the loot. It was about respect. Respect for those who had earned their place, who had proven themselves time and time again. And as the crew was taken away, their heads hung low in defeat. They understood. They had been outsmarted, outclassed, and overpowered. They had learned that in this world, strength and honor came in many forms. And they had just encountered one of the most powerful forms of all. The cold stone floor of the palace's dungeon was unforgiving beneath Marcus' knees as he was thrown into the small, dimly lit cell. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the sound of the lock clicking into place sent a chill down his spine. He could feel the weight of his failure settling over him like a heavy cloak. The once confident and ruthless leader of the crew was now nothing more than a prisoner, his plans shattered, his pride obliterated. The other members of the crew were thrown into adjacent cells, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. They had been outsmarted, outclassed, and overpowered by men they had thought were nothing more than a few palace guards. But now, as they sat in the cold darkness, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Marcus pressed his back against the wall, his mind racing. How had they gotten it so wrong? They had studied the palace for weeks, memorizing every guard's shift, every hidden passage. They had planned for every possible outcome, except for the one that had destroyed them. The elite guards. The royal soldiers who had moved with such precision and ease. They were unlike any enemies Marcus had ever faced. They were not just soldiers. They were a force of nature, an impenetrable wall that had crushed their every attempt. But there was something else. Something that gnawed at Marcus' mind. The soldiers hadn't just captured them. They had done so with a cold, calculated efficiency. There had been no hesitation, no mercy. They had been prepared for this moment, as if they had known the crew would come. It was as if the palace had been waiting for them, anticipating their every move. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional sound of distant footsteps echoing down the stone corridors. Marcus' thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a door creaking open. The guards had returned. One by one, they appeared before the cells, their eyes cold and unfeeling. The same soldiers who had captured them now stood in front of them, their faces unreadable. Marcus could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken judgment that hung in the air. They were not here to gloat. They were here to make a point. The tall soldier with the scar across his face stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "You thought you could steal from the crown," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You thought you could outsmart us. But you were wrong." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to respond, to spit out some defiant words, but he knew better. The soldier wasn't interested in words. He was interested in something else. "You'll regret this," Marcus muttered, his voice hoarse. "You can't keep us here forever." The soldier's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We don't need to keep you here forever. We just need to teach you a lesson. A lesson about who truly holds the power." With a sharp motion, the soldier signaled to the others. Without a word, they unlocked Marcus' cell and dragged him out into the corridor. The other crew members were pulled from their cells as well, their faces pale and filled with fear. They had no idea what awaited them, but the terror in their eyes was unmistakable. The group was marched down the long, dimly lit hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The tension was palpable, the air thick with dread. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. This was something more dangerous, more insidious. He had no idea what the soldiers had planned for them, but he knew it wasn't going to be pretty. They were led into a large chamber at the heart of the palace, its high ceilings and ornate decorations a stark contrast to the grim situation they now found themselves in. The soldiers shoved them to their knees, forcing them to face a large, imposing figure seated on a throne at the far end of the room. It was the king. The room fell into an eerie silence as the king studied them with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, just observed them as if they were nothing more than insects to be crushed beneath his boot. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the king spoke. "You thought you could take what belongs to me," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "You thought you could steal from the crown without consequence?" Marcus didn't dare look up. He could feel the weight of the king's gaze pressing down on him, suffocating him. The other crew members were silent, their heads bowed in shame. "You are not the first to make this mistake," the king continued. "And you will not be the last. But I will make sure that you are the last to suffer for it. You will learn what happens when you underestimate the power of the crown." The soldiers stepped forward, their faces cold and unfeeling. They were the king's personal guard, and they were there to ensure that the criminals paid the price for their audacity. One of the soldiers, the scarred man who had led the capture, stepped forward and grabbed Marcus by the collar, lifting him off the ground. Marcus' heart raced as he was dragged to the center of the room, the eyes of the king and his soldiers fixed on him. "You will be a lesson to anyone who dares to challenge us," the scarred soldier said, his voice filled with cold menace. "And we will make sure that your name is remembered." The tension in the room was unbearable. Marcus could feel the sweat dripping down his face, his body trembling with fear. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. The king rose from his throne, his eyes locked onto Marcus. "Take them to the courtyard," he ordered. "It's time for them to learn what happens when you dare to defy the crown." As the soldiers dragged them away, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him. This was it. There was no escape. The crew had been outsmarted, outclassed, and now they were about to pay the price. The cold wind howled through the courtyard, the moon casting long shadows over the stone floor. Marcus' heart pounded in his chest as he knelt on the cold ground, his hands bound behind his back. The king's guards stood in a tight circle around him, their eyes cold and unfeeling. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the wind. Marcus had always been in control. He had led his crew through countless heists, always one step ahead of the law. But now, in the heart of the king's palace, he was nothing more than a prisoner, at the mercy of men who had no intention of showing him any. The scarred soldier, who had led their capture, stepped forward. His eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. "You thought you could steal from the crown," he sneered. "You thought you could take what was mine and get away with it?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. They were caught. There was no escape. They had underestimated the king's power, and now they were paying the price. "You'll regret this," Marcus managed to say, his voice hoarse. "You can't keep us here forever." The scarred soldier smirked, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "We don't need to keep you here forever," he said. "We just need to teach you a lesson. A lesson about who holds the power." The soldier raised his hand, and the guards closed in, pulling Marcus roughly to his feet. His body ached from the struggle, but he refused to show weakness. They dragged him toward the center of the courtyard, where the king waited, his figure cloaked in shadows. The air was thick with tension, the sense of dread almost palpable. The king's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Bring them forward." Marcus and his crew were forced to kneel before the king, their heads bowed, their bodies trembling with fear. The king's presence was overwhelming, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Marcus could feel the king's gaze upon him, cold and unyielding. "You thought you could steal from me," the king said, his voice filled with authority. "You thought you could take what was mine without consequence?" Marcus' heart raced. He wanted to speak, to argue, but the words caught in his throat. They were nothing now. Helpless. His pride, his power, everything he had built, had been shattered in an instant. The scarred soldier stepped forward again, his eyes filled with malice. "You will learn what happens when you challenge the crown," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Your fate will be a lesson to anyone who dares to cross us." The soldiers began to move. They pulled Marcus to his feet again, this time with more force, dragging him toward the center of the courtyard. His mind raced, but his body felt numb. There was no way out. The soldiers were too many, too strong. His crew was broken, their eyes wide with fear. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but he refused to look back. He had to stay strong. For them. The scarred soldier's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus by the collar and yanking him forward. "You will regret this," he growled. "You'll beg for mercy before the end." Marcus fought to stay on his feet, his legs shaking with fear and pain. The soldiers formed a tight circle around him, their eyes cold and unfeeling. The king stood silent, watching the scene unfold. The scarred soldier raised his hand again, and Marcus braced himself for the blow. But it came faster than he expected. The soldier's fist collided with his face, sending him stumbling backward. The force of the punch left Marcus reeling, his vision blurring. Pain shot through his skull, but he refused to fall. He had to stay strong. He couldn't show weakness. The soldiers didn't stop. They closed in, each one taking their turn to strike. The blows came fast, each one harder than the last. Marcus fought to stay conscious, but the pain was overwhelming. His body trembled with each strike, his pride slowly slipping away with every hit. The crew watched in silence, their faces pale with fear. They had seen Marcus lead them through countless dangers, seen him fight without hesitation. But now they were watching him break. The scarred soldier stepped forward again, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, his voice mocking. "But it won't save you." Marcus' breath came in ragged gasps, his body battered and bruised. But even as the soldiers continued their assault, something inside him refused to give up. He clenched his fists, fighting to stay conscious. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't show them that they had broken him. The soldier raised his hand once more, but before he could strike, the king's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Enough." The soldier stopped, stepping back and allowing Marcus to collapse to the ground. His body was battered, his face bloodied, but he refused to stay down. He forced himself to sit up, his chest heaving with each breath. The king stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. He looked down at Marcus with cold, calculating eyes. "You thought you could take from me," he said. "But you will learn that no one is above the crown." "No one?" Marcus' mind raced, but his body refused to cooperate. His thoughts were clouded by pain, but through the haze, one thing was clear: the king had all the power. And they were nothing more than pawns in his game. The scarred soldier turned to the rest of the crew, his eyes filled with malice. "You will all learn the same lesson," he said. "You will remember this day for the rest of your lives." Marcus could feel the weight of the soldier's words, the cold finality in them. But even as he lay there, broken and defeated, something inside him refused to give up. He had been humiliated, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. The king's men had won this round. But the game wasn't over. And Marcus would find a way to rise again. The days following their capture blurred into a haze of pain and humiliation. Marcus' body ached from the brutal assault, each movement a reminder of the cruelty they had endured. His face was swollen, his eyes barely open, but his mind was still sharp. The king's men had broken his body, but they hadn't broken his spirit. Not yet. The cold stone walls of the dungeon felt like they were closing in on him. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows across the floor, and the distant sounds of footsteps echoed through the narrow halls. Marcus lay on the cold stone floor, his hands still bound, his mind racing. He could hear the faint whispers of his crew, but their voices were distant, muffled by the stone walls. He had been here for what felt like an eternity. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to turn the tide. The sound of a door creaking open snapped him from his thoughts. Marcus tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see who it was, but the footsteps were heavy, purposeful. A figure stepped into the dim light, tall and imposing. The figure was cloaked in shadows, but Marcus could feel the weight of their presence. "Still alive, I see," the voice was low, almost mocking. It was a voice Marcus knew all too well, the scarred soldier. He stepped closer, his boots echoing in the silence. "You're a tough one, Marcus," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you're still nothing more than a prisoner." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't going to give the soldier the satisfaction. The soldier knelt down beside him, his cold eyes studying him with cruel amusement. "You think you're going to escape?" the soldier sneered. "You're in my world now. And in my world, there's no room for men like you." Marcus lifted his head, his vision still blurry, but his defiance clear. "You'll regret underestimating me," he said through gritted teeth. "I've survived worse." The soldier chuckled darkly. "Worse? You think this is bad?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot against Marcus' ear. "You haven't seen anything yet?" Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to show fear. He wasn't afraid of this man. He had been through too much to be afraid now. The soldier stood up, his boots scraping against the stone. "I'll leave you to think about your fate," he said, his voice cold. "But know this, you're nothing. You're nothing more than a footnote in my story. And when I'm done with you, no one will remember your name." The soldier turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Marcus' heart raced, but his mind was already working, already plotting. He couldn't stay here forever. He had to find a way out. He had to find a way to fight back. Hours later, the door to the dungeon creaked open again. This time, the figure that stepped inside was different. Smaller, more nimble. A woman. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but Marcus could see the glint of steel at her side. She approached him quietly, her footsteps light and deliberate. When she reached him, she knelt down, her hands moving quickly to untie his restraints. Marcus didn't speak, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the situation. Was this a trap? Another test? "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced around the dark cell, her eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "I'm someone who doesn't like what's happening here," she said softly. "Someone who thinks the king's reign is about to end." Marcus blinked, trying to process her words. "What do you mean?" She looked at him then, her eyes sharp and calculating. "The king's power is built on fear, but fear doesn't last forever. People are starting to see the cracks in his rule. They're starting to realize that he's not invincible." Marcus' mind raced. Could it be true? Was there really a rebellion brewing? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. If he could get out of here, if he could join whatever movement was rising against the king, there was still hope. Hope for revenge. Hope for survival. The woman continued, her voice low and urgent. "You're not the only one who's been wronged. There are others who are waiting for someone like you to lead them. You've been in the shadows long enough, Marcus. It's time to step into the light." Marcus' heart raced. He had been a leader in the underworld, but this was different. This was a rebellion. This was about something bigger than himself. "I'm not a hero," he said, shaking his head. "I'm just a thief." The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Everyone starts somewhere." Before Marcus could respond, she moved quickly, her hands working to untie his bindings. The ropes fell away, and Marcus rubbed his wrists, feeling the blood return to his limbs. "I'm going to get you out of here," the woman said. "But you have to trust me." "Do you?" Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know who she was, or if he could trust her. But in that moment he realized something. He had no choice. The king's men had broken him, humiliated him, but they hadn't taken away his will to fight. And if this woman could help him get out, he would take the chance. "I trust you," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Then follow me." She stood, and Marcus followed her into the darkness, his mind still racing. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The king's reign was about to be challenged, and Marcus was going to be at the center of it. The spark of rebellion had been lit, and Marcus was ready to fan the flames. The tension in the air was suffocating as Marcus and the woman crept through the palace's hidden corridors. Their footsteps echoed softly against the cold stone, but the silence between them was thick with anticipation. They had reached the heart of the rebellion, and now there was no turning back. The woman, whose name was Lyra, led him toward the hidden chamber where the rebels were gathering. Marcus could feel the weight of the task ahead. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about vengeance. Lyra stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, her hand resting on the handle. She turned to Marcus, her eyes sharp with determination. "This is it. Beyond this door is the heart of the rebellion. If you're ready, we move now." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had spent years stealing from the king's court, living in the shadows. But now, the rebellion was his chance to strike back. To make the king pay for what he had done. Lyra pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with rebels. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an undeniable energy in the air. These were people who were ready to fight. People who were ready to bring down the king. At the center of the room stood a tall man with a commanding presence. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp with resolve. When he saw Marcus, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. "Marcus," the man said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "We've been waiting for you." Marcus stepped forward, his pulse quickening. "You've been waiting for me?" The man nodded. "We know your reputation. You've been a thorn in the king's side for years. Now, we need you to help us finish what we've started." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. He had spent years evading the king's grasp, but now he had a chance to take the fight to him. "I'm in," Marcus said, his voice firm. The man smiled grimly. "Good. We have a plan. But we need someone who knows the palace inside and out. Someone who can get us inside without being detected." Marcus' heart raced. He knew the palace better than anyone. He had slipped in and out of its walls countless times. This was his chance to use that knowledge for something bigger than himself. The rebels worked quickly, preparing for the assault. They gathered weapons, armor, and supplies, their movements efficient and determined. Marcus could feel the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. They had one shot at this. One chance to bring down the king. As the sun began to set, the rebels gathered at the edge of the city, hidden in the shadows. Marcus led them through the narrow streets, keeping a sharp eye out for any sign of the king's soldiers. Every sound, every movement, felt like a threat. But they pressed on, moving quickly and quietly until they reached the palace walls. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a cold light over the city. Marcus' heart pounded as he led the rebels up the walls, using ropes and hidden handholds to scale the fortress. They moved swiftly, but every second felt like an eternity. The guards were still patrolling, and the risk of discovery was high. When they reached the top, Marcus paused, scanning the courtyard below. The guards were spread out, their torches casting long shadows. But Marcus knew the way. He had been here before. He had slipped past these guards countless times. He motioned for the rebels to follow him and led them down a narrow staircase that led directly into the heart of the palace. The air was thick with tension as they moved through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by the stone floors. They were getting closer. Suddenly, sound. Footstep. A whisper. Someone was coming. Marcus froze, his heart racing. He motioned for the rebels to stop, pressing them into the shadows. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. A figure rounded the corner. It was the scarred soldier, the one who had tortured Marcus in the dungeon. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The soldier's expression twisted into recognition, but before he could react, Marcus lunged. He tackled the soldier to the ground, knocking the sword from his hand. The soldier let out a grunt of surprise, but Marcus was faster. He grabbed the soldier's blade and drove it into the stone floor beside him. "Move!" Marcus shouted to the rebels. They didn't hesitate. They surged forward, running down the corridor toward the throne room. Marcus stayed behind, keeping the soldier pinned down. But more guards were coming. He could hear them, The rebels reached the throne room. The final battle was upon them. Inside the throne room, the king stood at the far end, flanked by his most trusted guards. His eyes were filled with fury as he saw the rebels storm in. But he didn't seem afraid. He seemed confident. "You think you can take me down?" the king sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "I'm not alone anymore." The rebels surged forward, clashing with the king's guards. Swords rang out, and the room erupted into chaos. Marcus fought his way through the battlefield, his movements sharp and precise. He had been in countless fights before, but this was different. This was personal. He reached the king, his eyes locked onto the man who had caused so much pain. The king's face twisted into a mask of rage. "You think you can defeat me?" the king hissed, drawing his sword. "I am invincible." Marcus didn't hesitate. He lunged, his blade meeting the king's in a flash of steel. The two men clashed, their swords ringing out as they fought with everything they had. The king was strong, but Marcus was fueled by something deeper: revenge, justice, and the hope of a better future. The fight raged on, each strike bringing them closer to the end. But in the end, it was Marcus who emerged victorious. With a final, decisive blow, he brought the king to his knees. The throne room fell silent. Marcus stood over the fallen king, his chest heaving with exertion. The battle was won. The rebellion had succeeded. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt free.